Okay, so for our next presentation, we have Professor Ravi Gupta and Mike Ashfield. Mike Ashfield will be doing the presenting, and then Ravi will be doing like questions and answers afterwards.
If there's questions related to Indian traditions.
Okay, there you go. So typically, if there's questions.
The framework is Mike's.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah. Okay. The title of the talk is A Bare Theism for a Fully General Comparative Philosophy of Religion. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm a sort of generic philosopher of religion, and I had a kind of idea that I was like, Ravi has the content expertise relevant to this conference. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to plow on through, and then I'll clarify what will inevitably need clarification at the end. What sort of got me started thinking about this was this this particular claim from Paul Griffiths that that it's inevitable in the philosophy of religion that we center Christian thought. He argues that this is simply a function of the subdiscipline, at least in English, being shaped by its history, and so its practitioners should make no pretense at transcending or escaping that history. I was sort of shocked to see someone say this and disappointed, and so I thought, no, I think philosophers of religion can and should do better. In particular, in that article, he's arguing for sort of centering a particularly Christian conception of theism, and I think that if there is a normative concept of theism for comparative philosophy of religion, we should think that it would minimize the kind of parochialism that Griffiths is defending, which I think is appropriate in a confessional inquiry, but not in a sort of general comparative philosophy of religion. And so what the project is interested in doing is trying to identify, in contrast to, say, Thomistic theism, Christian theism, or even Abrahamic theism, or something that's a bit more inclusive, a normative concept of theism for comparative philosophy of religion should aim at what we'll call a bare theism, something very thin. Hugh Owen, for example, writes a bare theism of the kind that Christians share with Jews and Muslims. So that sounds Abrahamic, perhaps, but maybe more inclusive than that. Eric Silverman and his co-authors talk about bare theists who hold only to the existence of God. That's close to what I have in mind. We prefer this unassuming terminology of bare theism to something like Richard Swinburne's philosophical theism, which also aims at broad consonance with the Abrahamic traditions, but which stipulates, for example, that process theism is a rival. And I don't want to stipulate that out of the gate. So as a kind of like first characterization, what we're thinking is of something that would be shared by all countenancing the existence of God, including perhaps more than one high God. That term comes to us from anthropologists who use it in a variety of ways. I can come back to that later. I sort of like the vagueness of that term, high God, just as a useful sort of term to get sort of the first character, a kind of first approximation out of the way. I would be okay with this including perhaps more than one high God if that's coherent. Some have argued it's not. Graham Oppie, for example, thinks that to be God just is to be the one and only God. I'll talk in a moment about a paper from Dr. Goethe that suggests something similar. But what we don't want to include is those who expressly reject the existence of God or gods in favor of lesser deities, in favor of other supernatural, transcendent, or holy entities. And we certainly don't want to include those who reject all of the above. It'd be nice if the ontological commitments of bare theism were distinguishable from those of expressly non-theistic positions, including atheism, but also perhaps a pure animism, some traditions embracing only non-theistic deities, for example, some sects of Buddhism. This is in contrast to something, for example, that John Hicks says, where I think he unsatisfactorily defines theism as something as just strictly a belief in a deity, though perhaps more specifically a personal deity. I think that's too inclusive. That would draw a lot of traditions as theistic that don't want to self-identify that way. As a second desiderata, I think, desideratum, excuse me, bare theism should not entail that a tradition is theistic in virtue of something other than its highest posited deity or deities. It would be strange, for example, to deem Virgil's Roman pantheon theist in virtue of some minor being like Aeolus, god of the winds, rather than Jupiter or perhaps the Fates or something. So this is one intuition that I'm working from. Thirdly, a bare theism should identify something common to many paradigmatically theistic positions. It's meant to be an explication of the term, not an analysis, but a sort of specification that makes better sense of the way we actually use it. And it's okay if it's somewhat revisionary, but I wouldn't want it to be like entirely revisionary all over the place. I do want it to capture something of what we already mean by the term, but specifying it to make it more useful for a kind of general comparative philosophy of religion. But in doing that, I also want to try to minimize dependence on what we might call philosophical parochialism. So, for example, I think perfect being theism, or if monistic theism is an option, I think theism plausibly predates these views, although they are venerable formulations of its content. So I don't want to just stipulate to some controversial. I think you can find lots of people in English-speaking philosophy of religion just stipulating that theism is perfect being theism, for example, and I'm not interested in doing that either. Finally, it would be nice if a bare theism could clarify what's at stake in debates about a tradition's non-theism. So I'm coming to this. What sort of interested me in this is I'm fairly new to Utah. I teach a lot of Mormon students. And there's a lot of disagreement in my classrooms about whether or not Mormons are theists or not. And they disagree amongst themselves, actually, a little bit. So that's what brought me to this. So I'd like something that would helpfully sort of intervene in that debate, help clarify it, maybe also help us answer whether or not Plato's demiurge is a theistic god or Advaita Vedanta would be. So those are the desiderata. I'll move on. Some rival accounts. So Bruce Millam's fairly recent entry into this, it was sort of the thing that got me, gave me a kind of first specification to look at. He identifies theism with the proposition that the ultimate level of reality does not consist solely of an impersonal order. Okay. So to clarify, reality for him is the whole of existence, the widest possible frame, the most inclusive domain. Order here, by order we mean any arrangement in terms of patterns that enables explanation. That's what order is really about, it's about explanation. And so personal order just means that the best explanations any personal order is where the explanations for that domain terminate in appealing to factors that we associate with persons. So perhaps cognition has come up this morning, maybe that would be sufficient to count as personal. Anything that we sort of typically associate with the person. So to put this view to the test, consider the following fundamental or ultimate sources of local personal order. So take the fundamental agential jivas of Jainism. We could also look at the uncreated agential pre-embodied spirits of Mormonism. This is a view they have. There are infinitely many of these. Are there infinitely many of these? Yeah, I thought so. Good. So both of these accounts would count as theistic on Millam's view, and they would be theistic in virtue of any one of those infinitely many fundamental agential things. And that's a very radical kind of polytheism. But there are some problems, right? So like Jains identify as neither theist nor atheist, so we're already kind of failing desiderata 1. And it seems to locate Mormon theism in the wrong place, right? They want their view, if they identify as theists, they want to be theists in virtue of the Godhead that they worship, not in virtue of like their own souls and the infinitely many souls that have yet to be embodied. So, it seems like what's going on here? Okay, so let's look at a different view. So Dr. Göke has in his 2017 paper, Concepts of God and Models of the God-World Relation, he identifies God as the single ultimate ground of reality that is also worthy of worship. And I think this ethical monotheistic view may satisfy the 4 desiderata. I'll raise some doubts about the third one in a bit. But what I want to point out is that, it clearly outperforms Millam's account, but something that was stronger than Millam's but weaker than Goethe's could outperform both, and that's where our proposal comes in. So let's, for now, float the idea that theism should be identified with a proposition that the ultimate or fundamental level of reality consists primarily of an agential order, ontologically different in kind from ourselves. And this is what I was asking, sort of a self-serving question earlier to Dr. O'Connor. So I think this may outperform Goethe's account vis-a-vis Desideratum 3, since it still identifies something common to many paradigmatically theistic traditions, but it avoids the substantive philosophical assumptions of ethical monotheism in particular. Okay, so it will, in fact, admit a lot more things into the big tent of theism. But will it satisfy all four desiderata? Well, let's apply it and see what we get. So in doing this, Ravi and I adapted James Taylor's sort of organizing question method. There was this really great issue in Sophia on models of God a few years ago. And Taylor had this really great paper on sort of like a sort of question-based procedure, sort of developing a decision tree for mapping the conceptual space. We're going to do that, but some caveats. So first, the following sequence of questions has a twofold purpose. First, to determine what is reasonably included in the category of theism. Second, to clarify and illustrate the many species of theism. And as you'll see, when we get to past the sort of threshold word drawing for bare theism, it switches from, placing a bound on the category to sort of the second purpose of just illustrating the many species. It is a typology, not a hierarchy. So no progression is suggested through like higher and better or better views. It may give that impression, but that's not what we intend. And the examples are provisional. So we're not scholars of all these traditions. We were fixing an example this morning. And so we would welcome correction or refinement of examples. And we certainly do not intend to dismiss the internal diversity of any tradition. So sorts of the points about, are you sure you want to label everybody into that category as fun? We really would welcome that sort of help. So this will be an incomplete typology of the divine. So the first question, does a divine reality of any kind exist? You could say no and be a kind of global atheist or global fictionalist following Janine Diller or Robin Webvang. And then you would get off right here. You could give a sort of indeterminate answer, so you're not sure. None that I have met so far or something. You could be an agnostic, a kind of local atheist or local fictionalist. Or you could give a positive answer and proceed to divine realism. So the next question sort of proceeds on that assumption. We're going to model divine realism in one of the following ways. Is the divine reality categorical? How am I doing for time? Okay, so you could go for a kind of super categoricalism and say, no, it's not, the divine is beyond all categories. For that, we want to follow up and say, well, is there any use in provisionally applying the categories to the divine? Some will say no and go for kind of radical mysteriosophy, in effect, rejecting theology as an approach or a method altogether. I think some mysticisms are best understood this way. My sense is that is ultimately the view in the cloud of unknowing, but I'm not sure. I think that's the view. Some instead take a kind of provisional view of the value of theology. So I'm told this is Shankara's view. John Hick seems to sort of take this kind of view. He ultimately goes for a sort of trans-categorical view of the real. But seems to think that theology is a worthwhile thing to do provisionally. Instead, you might go for a kind of literal categoricalism. And so either way, whether you're doing it provisionally or you actually think you're speaking accurately about reality, we'll proceed to the next question. So is there any divine explanation of ultimate or fundamental significance? It is a typology of the divine, so we're interested in the divine sort of subset of these ultimist explanations. So some will say no, there is no ultimate or fundamental level. There's sort of infinite regress in every direction. And so if there are divinities of any kind, they are only of local explanatory significance. And this seems like at least one possible interpretation of the Norse cosmology and pantheon. So it does seem like it's a view that's existed. But if you say, yes, there is some kind of ultimate fundamental or fundamental sort of explanation, then you're going for a kind of ultimism of the kind that J.L. Schellenberg first introduced. So we'll start modeling ultimisms. Is or are the ultimate fundamental things agential in any way? Some say no. This seems to be this non-agential ultimism with, again, sort of deities of only local explanatory significance. This seems to be a view shared by Pure Land Buddhists, but also the Aztec worldview seems to be an example of this. And there I'm following the expertise of James Maffei. I'm not an expert there either, but Maffei certainly is. You could instead go for an agential ultimism. And Milam says this is just what it is to be a theist. But we've already seen that I think that's problematic. We don't want to get there just yet. So we move to the next question to further clarify what we mean by agential ultimism. So is or are the ultimate agential things ontologically distinct in kind from us? Some are going to say no. They're going to go for a kind of egalitarian agential ultimism. So the question is, okay, so is there one unified ultimate agential reality on this view? Some say no. This is the pluralistic view of Jainism that we mentioned before that causes problems for Milam. Some say yes. And they go for a kind of monism here. According to William Mander in his SCP article on pantheism, I think at least some of the things, so that's like a recent term of art in English. So I'm not sure, maybe not everything that gets called pantheism belongs here on this line, and I would welcome advice about how to think about it. I think this part is a weakness right now that we're still trying to work on. But certainly some things that would fall under that improperly specified term of art, I think, would go here and not seem plausibly theistic. Because on our view, this is where we would draw the line. Our proposed account of bare theism says, what it is to be a theist is to answer that, yes, there is an ultimate agential reality that is distinct in kind from us. So it is a kind of hierarchical agential ultimism. So from now on, we're going to proceed by question 6 thereafter, kind of just exploring some of the theistic conceptual space. And it's not so much a kind of, I guess I'm raising a bunch of questions that branch off in different directions, and some of these things are orthogonal to one another. So it's not so much a sort of linear progression anymore. But a first, I think, helpful question is classical logic sufficient for describing theism? So A.J. Cotnoir has a really cool paper where he thinks about sort of how theism would interact with dialethism in logic. And he talks about dialetheism, so kind of paradoxical theism. And there's a further question of whether or not the logical inconsistencies are best understood as features of God or not on this sort of view. Richard Swinburne has argued no, they're merely semantic. They're unavoidable sort of in our language or understanding, but some are perhaps willing to say yes. And I guess I'm also not a scholar of Descartes, but I think this is sort of his view. He at least seems to think that for all we know, it's possible that that there could be sort of genuine paradoxes in the divine nature, logical contradictions or something. So it's like epistemically possible that it's metaphysically possible. So it's not quite a yes, but it's something in the neighborhood. On the other hand, I think lots of people who work in the classical theistic tradition do seem to want to say that God is a kind of bounded by logic or something. Classical theism might be an example of logical theism. That's a bit, I just realized that's a bit pejorative to say that this is illogical and that's logical. So maybe I need a better name for that. Is or are the ultimate divine entity or entities substantive? Process theists say no, and characterize their opponents or other views as substance versions of theism. Is or are the ultimate divine entities ontologically distinct from the rest of reality? Panentheism, which I think it's controversial how best to specify this. I think Dr. Gupta has some interesting work on this as well. But I'm following John Culp's paper on this. He seems to think this is a perfectly fine way to characterize it, at least at one level of approximation, that the rest of reality is a proper part of God. But there's still room on that view for God to be ontologically different, to be something ontologically different in kind from us. As far as we know, is or are there lesser gods in addition? So if you say yes, there is just one highest thing, then there's still a further question of whether it would be the only thing. Traditional monotheists, many contemporary Abrahamic views are going to say no, but some say yes and count thereby as henotheists. And again, it's controversial, but this is one interpretation of early Judaism. I think it's fairly widely held that this is a good way of characterizing early Judaism. Is or are the highest gods the creators ex nihilo or out of themselves, ex deo, of the world? Some are going to say no, and could sort of amount to a kind of dualistic theism. So this seems to be Madhva's view, seems to be Mani's view or the Manichaeist view. Some say yes, God is the creator ex nihilo or ex deo of the world. Augustine famously says this. Is the world's existence necessary? Well, some say no. Aristotle famously argued the world's existence is contingent. Some traditions of Vedanta say the same thing. But it's possible to be a necessary world theist, and this would be one motivation for being a dualist, but it's not the only one. So that's why I want to sort of tease those questions apart. Does the gods or God interact with the world? A question that's been important in the last couple centuries, at least in the English-speaking world. No. If you say no, the next question is or are God's existence still evident in the natural order? Some want to say no, God's existence is still utterly transcendent. John Hick, for example, thinks that God creates the world at an epistemic distance for like sort of relational purposes, and seems to go sort of want God's existence purposely to be sort of hidden. So Millen calls this theism too. There's a really interesting discussion of it in his paper. Deists instead want to say, no, God doesn't interact with the world, but God's existence is nonetheless evident in the way that sort of the watchmakers have been, the complexity of the watch. Alternatively, you could say, yeah, God does interact with the world. I think many Abrahamic theists want to say this. Interactionist theism is sort of their preferred view, and this is also adopted by Avatar theology. Second last question, almost done. Is or are the superhuman ultimate agential things appropriately venerated as such? Well, I think some want to say no, that a mere philosophical theism is possible, and that this, for example, is compatible with the evil God hypothesis or the evil God challenge, which was sort of recently sort of brought back into the fore by this important paper by Stephen Law. But others want to say yes, and I guess for now we're calling this religious theism. And according to Dr. Gupta, this is a necessary feature of theism, but I humbly think not. So let's see. So final question, must all these categories ultimately fall away? And if you are game for the via positiva or theological categoricalism, you'll say no. But if instead this was all provisional, then you now begin sort of the process of kind of recessing or processing back to a kind of ultimate mysteriosity. The question was, does this satisfy all four desiderata? Well, we think that our incomplete typology of the divine and of theism illustrates that it does. We think that you can see that its ontological commitments are clearly distinguishable from expressly non-theistic positions. We think it does not entail that any tradition is theistic in virtue of something other than its highest posited deity. It identifies something common to many paradigmatically theistic positions while minimizing dependence on philosophical parochialisms, and it clarifies what's at stake in debates about various traditions, non-theism. So I think it's actually going to give for example, thinking about the controversy among my Mormon students in Utah, I think it's going to give a very clear answer that, like, yes, some of those accounts are non-theistic, most of them in fact, but a really carefully specified version of Mormon theology could be theistic. So thank you.
So thanks, Mike and Ravi. Straight over to the questions, how you're eager to go. So what I saw. No. Okay. Go for it.
Could you speak a little bit to the panentheism, transnaturalism, please? And
the transnaturalism. So Chaitanya Vaishnava Vedanta answers yes and no to the question. Well, there's different characterizations of how the relationship between the world and God come together. And one of the answers given is more of the part whole theology that we heard more akin to what Dr. O'Connor was talking about in his presentation. Other accounts claim that there's a complete unity and complete difference at the same time. And so therefore, classical forms of logic don't work in terms of explaining that relationship. And therefore, that being not illogical, but supralogical or paradoxical in nature. So the real question basically that emerges is, what's the relationship between the divine and everything else? Mm-hmm. And if that answer is given both in terms of unity and difference, and neither one is subsumed under the other, then you get this sort of paradoxical theism. If you try to explain it in terms of part and whole, or aspect and or quality and qualified in the way that Ramanuja wants to do, then it becomes less paradoxical, and the explanation becomes then more classically logical and more along the lines of what O'Connor was discussing in relation to Ramanuja's theism. So in Chaitanya Vaishnavism, there's actually different ways of characterizing that relationship depending on the philosopher you're working with.
Great, thank you. And you think that in that sense, the line will be subsumed with the panentheism, then decide to transcend it.
Right, exactly.
Great.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, thanks for your interesting talk. I really liked it. I just have for now a short question. Could you skip to your definition of theism? Because I was wondering whether, on your counsel, panentheism and pantheism are not a kind of theism.
Yeah, so panentheism seems like it. So this is, I think as I was ruminating on Dr. O'Connor's talk, I don't want to speak for Ravi, so maybe you answer the question for yourself. I wonder if maybe I don't want to go as strong as saying that it has to be an ontological difference in kind, but there has to be some kind of meaningful difference in kind. And it seems like for maybe that's easier for the panentheist to get than for the pantheist. And so if it drew a line between those two, I think I could live with that. But I think it is the weakest, for me, it feels like the weakest part of the proposal at the moment. So it's the right place to push. But I wish I had a better answer, but that's kind of where I'm at right now. Yeah. What do you think, Ravi?
Yeah, I agree with what you said. And the only thing I would add to that is just, I think that word ontological may be a little bit strong. And if we can find a better word to describe it in a weaker sense of there should be some way to articulate a difference between us and this ultimate reality.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can be a part whole sort of relationship, even if substantively, you know, the jiva, for example, is of the same quality of eternity and awareness and bliss. But there's some way of distinguishing between the individual and the whole, or the part and the whole. That without any distinction present, I think in our discussions, that's where we felt we'd be okay if someone truly was able to say that there was absolutely no difference between us and any kind of ultimate. Yeah.
Just maybe a brief follow-up, but just for historical reasons. I mean, when you think of the conception of theism deployed in the Freemasonry, I mean, like the great architect of the world.
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds a bit similar. I mean, just as an observation. So,
Okay.
because as far as I know, they also they want to propose this notion.
Yeah, I hadn't thought
the
about
great
that. That's a really actually helpful place to look, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. No.
Yeah, as you feel.
Okay. Well, go ahead and.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure whether this question fits, so I'll throw it out there.
I mean, it's all framed in terms of, I really like your presentation. It's all framed in terms of the logic and the decision trees and how we go down
Right.
paths. But if we're, so from analogically, perhaps like we're trying to work out what's God's phone number. We get the right sequence of digits, right? We call God. But if there's God, there's the possibility that we get called, he calls us.
Okay.
And do we need a philosophy of revelation in this somehow? Because a lot of these thinkers are not thinking, they're not doing their theological reflection purely on logic. They're doing it in relation to sacred texts and how they interpret them in exegesis and all that. So so there's that whole dimension in there, how they get to their positions, which is not reflected in an analytic philosophical frame.
I am happy to grant all of that. But that seems like a kind of epistemic question about like what it means to sort of be like for this sort of being to reveal itself or something, and like what.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's one of the big questions anyway.
Yeah.
Not just what are the characteristics of this being, but I guess perhaps a some sort of thing.
Sure. I mean, so we could ask more questions to further specify sort of the behavior of the being if we want. Like, what is it? So if you're, I mean, already that question sort of assumes a kind of interactionist theism, which was one of the options. And so then, yeah, you could ask more questions about interactionist theology to sort of like, you know, specify like which account of revelation you go for.
So I think it's a little more of the interaction theology, because pretty much all the sacred Christians have the sacred text based on the sense of revelation.
That's right. So, but insofar as we're sort of interested in sort of explicating the concept of theism in particular, that's why I'm sort of. But of course, there are going to be interactionist views for deitists, for non-theists of various kinds, right? So, but it won't be an interactionist theism; it'll be an interactionist something else. So, I'm sort of happy to take all that on. I just don't think that it's like it doesn't seem like a problem. Yeah,
You'll go next, Mr. Cotton, for a little while. Sit and we'll go.
Good. Good. Thank you very much for your talk. Interesting. So perhaps a big picture question, because of course, as I see it, you are trying to define the concept of theism or verityism, right? You're trying to give a definition, correct? Something like that.
An explication.
Yeah.
Not a sort of analysis of the ordinary language term or something. But
Sure. I was just wondering because the so-called classical theory of concepts has so many problems, right?
Right.
I mean, we know that
Yes.
against time,
Yes.
criticism against the attempt of defining the concept of game. So I just thought if a kind of family resemblance approach could be useful. I mean, because we have so many different views of what theism is. So and also I'm thinking about the feasibility of giving like this comprehensive definition. Is it possible?
Good. So I think so. Giving an analysis of the ordinary language term, I think would be hopeless. And that I think a family resemblance view is probably the best option you could give to sort of try to explain the way the word is actually used. But for people who like Paul Griffiths and some of these other people who want to try to deploy some term, to try to arbitrate some question of like whether these views sort of belong together. Now you might just object to that project. You might just say, look, like let people call themselves whatever they want to call themselves. And let's just understand, like when we're trying to sort of just understand the distinctions between different views, let's just understand the differences in their own right and not worry about like these questions of labeling. That's fine. I mean, some people are just, that's going to be the methodology they prefer. But insofar as there do seem to be a lot of people who want to try to arbitrate this question and like what deserves the name, what doesn't, I think you have to then, the only option is to give some kind of explication that is, you know, trying to be as least revisionary as possible. And then, you know, then it's just it becomes a game of like who has the most plausible defense of their explication. And so maybe that's all that I'm doing here. And so the sort of, yeah.
And if I can just add to that, I think an important part of this project is particularly trying to break open the space of philosophy of religion to the discussion of non-Abrahamic traditions by not embedding the assumption into the concept, right? So while it is a game of you know, people can call themselves whatever they want, and that's not something that certainly we can arbitrate. And in some sense, it's a intellectual game way up here, but it has very practical implications, I think, for philosophy of religion that both of us have felt is, you know, too swift and comfortable in terms of dismissing the sorts of conversations that are occurring at this conference.
Yes, sir. It's just going back to the question of revelation.
Yes.
And yes, I mean, in a way, it's just a question of epistemology. But there might be, I can see, you know, some type of people like Karl Barth would say like, well, yeah, conceptually, like what you're talking about, theism here, and then the theism, so-called theism in Indic tradition might, like, you know, conceptually look similar, but ultimately, the real God is only revealed by this particular scripture. So for someone like that, I'm not quite sure this conversation would be meaningful at all. So in that sense.
Well, so just to clarify, and then maybe you can, because I think I'm just not understanding, maybe I wasn't understanding the first question too. So if they say to me, this conversation isn't meaningful because God reveals himself only through, I mean, I think the neo-Orthodox view is that God's revelation is always actually self-revelation, right? It's not really, I mean, it's through the scripture maybe, but like it's really God's self. But I mean, my question to them will be like, well, what do you mean by God? You say that God only reveals God's self through the scripture. And then they'll give me an answer like this, and we can have that conversation. So it seems unavoidable that it doesn't sort of come back to something like this that we can have a conversation about. And so it doesn't seem to me, I still don't see the problem for this project, I guess.
Yeah, well, I guess I think because you are interested in conversation, so you could go on developing this typology. But the only point I'm making is that I could see like a scriptural fundamentalist.
Oh, sure.
Could you know, look at this and say, oh, that's an interesting intellectual exercise.
Yes.
But ultimately, the God I'm interested.
Yes.
For ultimate reality, I'm interested, cannot be covered by this or cannot be compared. Like this, because I think also like what Ravi also is trying to do is to open up the conversation with, for example, Vedantic traditions, right? But then again, also looking from Indian side, I could also see like, well, no, but then actually our God is ultimately revealed only through the Vedas.
Yeah.
So it might look similar, but then ultimately it has nothing to do with what you're talking about. So when
that feels like a rejection of, I mean, that also amounts to sort of rejecting comparative philosophy of religion.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it seems unsurprising then that right. I mean, like, it just doesn't seem like a problem for the view. It's just like they're so far outside of the methodological starting point that sure, they might just say like, sure, you know, do your intellectual exercise. I'm not interested. And I'll be like, that's fine, I'm also not interested in someone who doesn't want to have the conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Benedict here.
I mean, just one remark and one question. So probably you also need a typology of reasons for.
Yeah, good, yeah.
Like, is it revelation? Is it?
Yeah, that would be,
reason?
yeah,
What
great,
is
yeah.
revelation?
Yeah.
And question is, how do you deal with the counterexamples? I mean, for instance, I just was thinking of Philip Goff's latest book, is into why the purpose of the universe or something.
Okay.
And he defends the position I remember rightly, refers to as atheistic cosmopsychism.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
So because he doesn't want to be a theist and he doesn't want to be an atheist.
Yes.
And he says, well, that the ultimate or fundamental level of reality consists primarily of an agential order.
Yes.
Ontologically different, it comes from ourselves, but it's the universe in a way on his account. So
Yes.
he would say, well, my account fits your definition of theism, but I don't want it to be theism or whatever. I mean, I think it's ultimately, but so how would you?
How would I answer? Yeah. Well, I would have to know more about the view, but my suspicion is that his discomfort with that label comes from the fact that it is so often deployed in this very narrow way.
Okay.
And so if I say, well, look, if that's all you mean, then I'm happy to say that that's theism, and that in fact many views account sort of come into that label. And now actually it feels like there's less dividing many theistic traditions from Goff's view than he might have thought.
And I think that's part of the benefit of this sort of project, is that I think people who ought to be comfortable with the term, or for who share more in common with theistic positions than they want to recognize, given the use of the term theism in a popular sense, might feel included in the conversation, whereas others who use that term but do so rather uncritically may want to distinguish themselves, or will find a way to distinguish themselves through that technology.
Joanna?
I have the same question about Philip Goff.
Okay, thank you. It's a great question. Yeah. There was a, yeah.
So this theism doesn't entail that you think that the ultimate level of reality is like has to be worshipped or is better than us or anything like that.
Right. So, and I mean, that is, it is controversial whether or not, I mean, some people think that there are some responses to like the evil God challenge that just want to say like that can't be theism. But I do feel like, so I need to read more about the responses, but some of those responses do feel a little bit like just table pounding. And that just doesn't seem like a good answer to me. So yeah, on the view that we're countenancing, it might be possible to be sort of a theist and sort of think that this thing, it is different in kind from us. Like it might be hard not to be in awe, or hard not to sort of, it might be very natural to worship the thing. Or you might go in and say that, in fact, it is worthy of worship, but necessarily, right? So it's compatible with that, but yeah, it's not necessitated by the view.
Like, there's some sense of like, okay, if I talk to like a Christian, and I'm like, so like if I talk to them, we're referring to the same being.
Yes.
But then the minute you start saying, well, that being is like fundamentally bad, it's like, okay, you're just talking about a different being.
Yeah.
Like I can go into Mike Ashfield, and if someone else thought you were wearing a red shirt, I'd be like, no, he's wearing a blue shirt.
Yeah.
It's fine, so but
Right. So, I mean, I think it makes perfect sense that two practitioners of two living religions that worship God would find it really weird that that they could, if they're both talking about the same thing, that someone else would say, "Oh, I'm talking about that same thing too," and I think it's equal. But on the other hand, so like if you're having a discussion about the problem of evil, yourself, your Christian friend, and someone else. If that person says, look, I actually think like all the other explanations that you want to go in for that are theistic, I'm happy to accept all of those. But when it comes to the problem of evil, I don't think that you have any kind of good explanation. And so I'm going to go in for everything except thinking that God has good reasons for allowing like what happens, the evil that we see in the world. At that point, the space is so small that it seems to me that maybe they do deserve to be in the conversation as theists. Yeah.
Okay, I think we've
Great, yes,
At that
thank you very
time,
much. Yeah.
Of course, the conversation can continue at any time, please do.
Yeah.